Hey guys, tonight's story is about one of the most unbelievable bank heists ever attempted, a billion-dollar cyber attack pulled off by hackers working for the North Korean government. With nothing but emails and malware, they broke into the Bangladesh Central Bank and tried to steal $1 billion from an account at the Federal Reserve in New York. No masks, no guns, just a few quiet keystrokes and a printer that mysteriously stopped working. So, before you get comfortable, if you enjoy these late-night stories, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps me keep making them. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see you guys tuning in every night. Now, dim the lights, put on some headphones for a more immersive experience, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Bangladesh, February 7th, 2016. The director of the Bangladesh Central Bank stepped out of the elevator on the 9th floor, past a hallway that smelled of dust and old air, and into the accounts and budgeting department, the most restricted part of the building. This was the place where the country's money was tracked down to the last coin, the place where nothing should go wrong. But something had been wrong for days. The printer wasn't working, not just any printer, the one connected directly to the bank system, quietly printing records of every single transaction, all day and all night. Now it sat still and silent, like it had decided to take a vacation, and without it, there was no real-time record of what was happening inside the bank's accounts. All morning, staff tried to fix it. They unplugged it, plugged it back in, tapped at it, argued over it. Finally, after hours of work, it came back to life. The tray began filling with paper, spitting out pages that had been stuck in the system for days. At first, the director felt relief. Then he saw something strange. There were far more reports than there should have been, and the numbers on them didn't look right. Page after page showed massive payment orders, 35 in total, sending huge amounts of money from the Bangladesh bank's own account to other banks overseas. No one had approved these transfers. No one had even heard of them. And the SWIFT system, the supposedly unbreakable banking network, wasn't supposed to let this happen. The more he read, the worse it got. This wasn't just a few million gone. It was almost $1 billion, a number so large it looked like a mistake, but it wasn't. The questions came fast. Where was the money going? Who sent it? And could they stop it? Staff rushed to their computers trying to cancel the orders, but the printer breakdown had already given the thieves a head start. It looked like the Bangladesh Central Bank had just lost $1 billion, all because of a faulty printer. But this was only the start. What happened that day had begun 9 months earlier, the first steps in one of the boldest bank heists in history. Philippines, May 2015. On a hot afternoon in Manila, a group of men walked into the Jupiter Street branch of RCBC Bank. The branch sat in Makati, a busy glass and steel part of the city where businessmen in suits brushed past street vendors, selling snacks from plastic tubs. The men didn't look like high rollers. They weren't there to make headlines. They simply filled out forms, signed papers, and opened 4 brand new bank accounts. Each account started with just $500, barely enough to cover a modest rent deposit in the city. The men shook a few hands, took their receipt slips, and walked out. They never came back. The accounts sat untouched for months, forgotten in the bank system. At the time, no one noticed anything strange. Accounts are opened every day. People disappear from them every day. This looked like more of the same. Back in Bangladesh, life was moving fast. The country's economy was one of the fastest growing in the world. The central bank sat in Dhaka's financial district, a solid block of concrete and glass surrounded by a city bursting at the seams with nearly 20 million people. The streets outside were pure chaos, car horns, bicycle bells, street vendors shouting over the roar of traffic. Inside, the central bank's job was to keep the nation's finances stable. And in a country still building its economic future, losing $1 billion of public money wasn't just bad, it was unthinkable. Fast forward to January 2016, 1 month before the disaster. A bank employee was going through his email at work, clicking through the usual mix of reports, memos, and spam. Nothing stood out. Somewhere in the pile was a message that didn't seem important. He opened it, glanced at whatever it contained, and moved on. At the time, it was just another email on just another day. But this one was different. Hidden inside was a program, malware, waiting quietly for its chance. The moment the message was opened, the program began installing itself deep in the bank's system. From that moment, the attackers had a way in. The malware gave them the ability to move unseen inside the network. They could watch the employees work. They could study the bank's systems, its routines, and its weaknesses. Day after day, they stayed invisible, learning exactly how the bank moved its money. They weren't in a hurry. They had already waited months since those 4 quiet bank accounts in Manila. Now they were patient enough to wait a little longer, because when the time came, they intended to take everything they could. Dhaka, February 4th, 2016. It was just after sunset on a quiet Thursday evening. The offices of the Bangladesh Central Bank were mostly empty. The lights dimmed, the air still. The weekend was about to begin. Friday and Saturday, the official days off in most Muslim-majority countries. But in the server room, far from the break room and copy machines, something had just woken up. The intruders were back. They slipped in through the same digital backdoor they had quietly installed weeks earlier. Only this time, they weren't here to snoop. This wasn't about watching anymore. They were here to move money. This was the final act. They moved carefully, typing commands like seasoned insiders, because now, technically, they were insiders. With full access to the bank's SWIFT terminal, the secure messaging system used by banks all around the world, they could send out trusted payment orders that looked completely legitimate. And for the most part, they were. That's what made this so dangerous. SWIFT, short for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is basically the nervous system of global banking. It doesn't move the money itself, it just tells the other banks what to do. But its messages are trusted like gospel. So when a SWIFT terminal says send $81 million to this account in Manila, that money gets sent, no questions asked. Now SWIFT is secure, military grade they say, but it only works if the people using it don't leave the door wide open. And in the case of Bangladesh Bank, that's exactly what had happened. The hackers didn't break into SWIFT. They didn't need to. They got in through the bank's cheap switches, outdated firewalls, and virus protection that hadn't been updated in months. Once inside, they copied real login details, studied the daily operations, and learned exactly how the payment requests were formatted. So when they finally hit send, the fake payment orders looked just like the real ones. They even went as far as using actual dates, real formats, and believable instructions. They knew what they were doing. They'd waited patiently. And now, right before a long weekend, they pulled the trigger. One by one, the requests started rolling out. Millions of dollars, dozens of transfers, all routed through the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the exact same place where the Bangladesh Central Bank kept part of its national reserves. This wasn't just a cyber attack. It was one of the boldest attempts at robbing a central bank in modern history, and it was working. While the streets of Dhaka quieted for the weekend half a world away, American servers were processing the orders, lines of code that looked completely normal. No alarms were triggered, no red flags raised, no calls made. It was a clean operation, for now, but the damage had already begun. By the early hours of Friday morning, the job was in motion. 35 transfer requests, each one dressed up to look completely legitimate, were now speeding through the SWIFT network toward the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The total? $951 million, almost $1 billion. The choice of New York wasn't random. The Bangladesh Central Bank kept one of its most important accounts there, a high-security reserve account holding billions in US dollars. That money wasn't sitting there for decoration. It was used for international settlements, the kind of transactions that pay for imports, clear foreign debts, and keep the wheels of the economy turning. Now, according to these forged payment orders, nearly $1 billion of it was suddenly on the move. The instructions were precise. Send the money from the New York Fed to a scatter of accounts across Asia. The destinations ranged from the Philippines to Sri Lanka, all carefully chosen and prepped in advance. Each transfer was broken down into clean, believable amounts, routed to accounts that already existed. Most of them opened quietly months earlier. The hackers knew what would raise eyebrows and what wouldn't. No messy typos, no impossible figures, no obvious mistakes. It was all clockwork, and just like that, the operation was over. Hours of work, months of preparation, condensed into a flurry of electronic messages. The hackers logged out, erased their traces, and vanished from the system. Somewhere on the other side of the world, Dhaka's streets were quiet. The central bank's offices dark. No alarms, no urgent calls. Inside New York Fed servers, payment orders were lined up, ready to be processed like any transaction. By sunrise in Bangladesh, almost no one knew nearly $1 billion was halfway out the door. Friday morning in New York City. The air outside was cold, but inside the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the nerve center for much of the world's money. The pace was as steady as ever. This was one of the most secure and trusted financial institutions on the planet, the place where governments, central banks, and giant corporations parked their fortunes. On the processing floor, Bangladesh's payment orders slid into the queue like any other day's business. The instructions had come through swift, and swift was gospel. These were supposed to be bulletproof, the kind of messages that didn't need second guessing. Each one bore the correct codes, signatures, and authorizations. On paper, or rather in code, they were perfect. There was no reason to suspect anything was wrong, and so the Fed began doing exactly what it did best, quietly, methodically, and without drama, moving money across the globe. Billions could pass through in a single afternoon without anyone batting an eye. Meanwhile, halfway across the world in Dhaka, Sunday morning crept in. In Bangladesh, the weekend ran Friday to Saturday, so the central bank was just waking back up from its 2-day pause. Employees trickled into the building, sipping tea, settling into their desks, most of them unaware that almost $1 billion had been spirited out of their New York account while they were off. The accounts and budgeting department still had its own headache to deal with, the cursed printer. For days now, the automated printer connected to the Swift terminal, the one that was supposed to spit out real-time confirmations of every transfer, had been stubbornly silent. No paper, no receipts, no record of what had just happened. The tray sat empty, as if nothing in the financial world had moved all week. That backlog wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Those printouts were the first, and sometimes only, way to spot something unusual in time to stop it. And the worst part? This wasn't really a technical glitch at all. The printer hadn't failed by accident. It had been deliberately sabotaged, jammed up just long enough to blind the bank at the exact moment it needed its eyes open the most. The transfers were already in motion, the thieves were already ahead, and in Dhaka, no one knew it yet. The hackers hadn't relied on luck, they'd built in insurance. While the transfers were firing off across continents, they scrubbed the Swift database inside Bangladesh Bank, deleting traces of their payment orders. Anything that could have raised a flag was gone. And that stubborn printer? That was no accident. It had been deliberately taken offline so no one would see the confirmations piling up. Every extra hour the printer stayed silent was another hour they could get the money out. And the money was moving. In Sri Lanka, $20 million dropped into an account at Pan Asia Bank under the name of the Shalika Foundation. On paper it sounded like a charity, something that might fund scholarships or community projects. In reality, it was nothing of the sort. This was one of the landing pads, one of 35 transfer destinations scattered across Asia, all triggered from the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. Each payment slipped into place like a bead on a string, connecting New York to accounts in Manila, Colombo, and beyond. Back in Dhaka, the weekend was over, and the printer finally wheezed back to life. Sheets began spitting out in rapid succession, days of missing records now tumbling into the tray. Staff gathered around, flipping through the pages. At first it was confusion, lines of numbers, codes, bank names. Then it shifted to disbelief. 35 payment orders. Nearly $1 billion gone. Phones came out, orders were shouted, and someone was tasked with sending a stop payment request to the New York Fed immediately. But there was one last cruel twist of timing. It was Sunday in New York. The offices were dark. No one was there to pick up the call. The clock kept ticking. The money kept moving. And the gap between discovery and action was exactly what the thieves had counted on. By the time the staff at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York walked through the doors on Monday morning, the damage looked done. The transfer orders from Bangladesh had already been sitting in their system all weekend, like unattended packages on a busy train platform. Money, in theory, could have been halfway around the globe by now, but then came the surprise, an unexpected stroke of luck. The Fed's automated screening system had quietly flagged 30 of the 35 transactions for manual review, not because someone suspected a hacking operation, but because one of the payment orders contained a word that happened to match the name of a blacklisted shipping company tied to Iranian sanctions violations. It was a total coincidence, a bureaucratic quirk that by sheer chance threw up a giant red stop sign. That little glitch in the system ended up saving roughly $870 million. Once the flagged transfers landed on an employee's desk for review, the oddities became impossible to ignore. There were far too many payment instructions coming from Bangladesh at once, an unusually high number in a single day. The destinations were private companies, not other central banks or major government accounts, and the total sum? Almost $1 billion in one sweep. That alone was enough to make anyone suspicious. Then the stop payment request from Bangladesh Bank finally came through. With the order in hand, the Fed froze the flagged transactions before they could go any further. So that was it then. Caught in time. Disaster avoided. Or so it seemed. Because while most of the money was saved, some of it, millions, was already on the move, slipping into accounts where it would vanish faster than anyone could track it. "30 transactions were frozen in their tracks, but 5 of them, just 5, slipped through, and those 5 were carrying $101 million. The question now was simple: where did the money land? The first transfer led investigators far from Manhattan to Sri Lanka. Exactly $20 million had arrived in an account at Pan Asia Bank, routed through Deutsche Bank and labelled as a payment to a local charity called the Stalker Foundation. On paper it looked harmless enough. A charitable foundation receiving international funds happens all the time, but then a bank employee took a closer look. Something didn't sit right. The sum was far too large for such a small NGO, especially one that, in reality, had barely any footprint. No major projects, no significant history, and certainly no reason to suddenly be receiving millions from halfway across the world. The employee kicked it up the chain, sending the payment back to Deutsche Bank for verification. In Frankfurt, the transfer was scrutinized in more detail. That's when they spotted a small but glaring red flag. The word foundation in the beneficiary name had been misspelled, foundation. Just one misplaced letter, but it might as well have been a neon sign saying fraud. A little digging revealed the Stalker Foundation was nothing more than a shell. Fake paperwork, fake background, fake everything. It existed only on paper, just long enough to try to catch this wire transfer before disappearing. With that discovery, the payment was blocked, reversed, and sent back to the Bangladesh Bank's account in New York. 20 million saved. That left 4 transactions still in play, 4 transfers that had already made it past the safety net. And together they carried what was left of the loot, 81 million. All 4 of the surviving transfers, what was left of the stolen fortune, landed in the exact same place, the RCBC Bank's Jupiter Street branch in Manila. Not just any branch, but the very same one where, 9 months earlier, those mysterious men had opened 4 bank accounts with $500 each, and then vanished without ever returning. Now those long-dormant accounts suddenly roared to life. Millions of dollars began pouring in from New York, hitting each account like clockwork. There was no hesitation, no waiting. Within hours, the funds were on the move again, withdrawn in chunks and immediately funneled into the Philippines casino industry. And here's the trick: casinos in the Philippines weren't covered by the country's strict anti-money laundering laws at the time. Once the money was inside, it was transformed into gambling chips, run through the tables and cashed back out as clean, untraceable currency. Whatever paper trail had existed was now little more than smoke. Back in Dhaka, the Bangladesh Bank was scrambling to send urgent stop payment requests to the Philippines. But there was one more twist of bad luck or brilliant planning, depending on whose side you were on. Monday, February 8th wasn't just any day in Manila, it was Chinese New Year, a public holiday. Banks were closed, regulators were at home, the country's financial system was effectively on pause. Every hour of delay gave the hackers more time to move the money deeper into the system, further out of reach. It wasn't just a theft, it was a masterclass in timing. And so far, the timing had been perfect. In the end, the trail to the missing millions wound its way back to 2 names, Ding and Gao, both Chinese nationals. Both ghosts in the system until their identities surfaced. They weren't the masterminds, not even close, but they were critical cogs in the machine, the ones who physically set up the fake RCBC accounts months before the heist. Without them, the money would have had nowhere safe to land once it left New York. They were the bridge between a line of code in Bangladesh and stacks of untraceable casino cash in Manila. Authorities in the Philippines quickly zeroed in on them, but Ding and Gao were already gone, vanished before the net could close. Their destination, Macau, a glittering gambling haven and special administrative region of China, well outside Bangladesh's legal reach. Once there, they simply blended into the city's labyrinth of casinos, hotels, and high-roller lounges. With their escape, the last threads tying the stolen funds to flesh-and-blood suspects began to fray. The $81 million that slipped through, less than the billion originally attempted, but still one of the largest successful bank robberies in modern history, was effectively gone. When cybersecurity teams dissected the digital break-in, they found a familiar fingerprint. The malicious code buried in Bangladesh Bank's system had cousins, nearly identical strains used in other high-profile cyber attacks. And every time investigators followed the trail, one name kept appearing: Lazarus. The Lazarus Group, an elusive hacking collective linked by multiple governments to North Korea, had been connected to bank thefts, cryptocurrency raids, and even the infamous Sony Pictures hack. Now, the same shadowy outfit was suspected of pulling off a heist so bold it read more like a Hollywood screenplay than a real-world crime. Only this time there would be no neat ending, no arrests, no money recovered, just a billion-dollar question mark and a digital fingerprint pointing toward one of the most mysterious and dangerous hacking groups on the planet. As investigators dug through the digital wreckage, a clearer, if more disturbing picture began to form. Buried in the server logs was a single breadcrumb. The attack servers had been accessed by an IP address registered in North Korea. It happened only once, like a shadow slipping briefly into the light. But that was enough to raise every eyebrow in the room. There was more. Hidden inside the malware itself were fragments of Korean language code, commands, comments, the sort of things a programmer might leave behind if they assumed no one else would ever see them. Could these be deliberate plants meant to throw investigators off? Possibly. Cybersecurity experts don't discount false flags, but most agreed the weight of the evidence pointed in one direction: North Korea, and this wouldn't have been their first rodeo. The group linked to the attack, known as Lazarus, had a rap sheet stretching from cyber espionage to outright sabotage. They'd hacked South Korean banks and broadcasters. They'd been tied to military cyber warfare programs, and in 2014 they became infamous for the Sony Pictures hack, a retaliatory strike over the comedy film The Interview, which mocked North Korea's leadership. That attack wiped servers, leaked unreleased films, and humiliated a major Hollywood studio. But the Bangladesh job was something different. Lazarus wasn't just flexing muscle, they were running a money pipeline. The stolen funds didn't just vanish into crypto wallets or offshore accounts. They moved through laundering hubs like Macau, North Korea's unofficial financial backdoor. Thanks to the two Chinese middlemen, Ding and Gar, investigators knew that's where the Bangladesh millions had landed. From there, it's believed they were wired straight into the regime's coffers in Pyongyang. And the uses? Experts suspect the money helped fund the country's nuclear weapons program, kept luxury goods flowing to the elite, and shored up a struggling economy. Some analysts even estimated the heist's take could have been a noticeable bump to North Korea's GDP. If that's true, it would mark the first documented case of a nation-state directly robbing foreign banks for profit. Not with sanctions or diplomacy, not with warships or missiles, but with a keyboard, patience, and a bit of malicious code. And if a government can quietly lift $81 million from a central bank, what's next? Political campaign interference? Weapons systems sabotage? Civilian savings accounts drained overnight? Or, if they're feeling truly diabolical, maybe even hacking YouTube channels? Just imagine the ransom demands. North Korea had pulled off one of the most ambitious cyber heists in history, stealing millions without firing a shot. But not all their operations were silent or digital. Some were messy, public, personal. Like what happened at an airport in Malaysia on an ordinary morning in 2017. Kuala Lumpur International Airport, February 13th, It was morning. Crowds moved like slow rivers through terminals. Luggage wheels clicked against the tiles. Coffee lines were long. Security lines were longer. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just another busy day at one of Asia's major travel hubs. Among the noise and movement walked a man with a quiet face and a slightly worried look. His name was Kim Jong-nam, older half-brother to Kim Jong-un, once the heir to North Korea, now just a man trying to catch a flight to Macau, where he lived in exile under Chinese protection. No bodyguards, no entourage, just a polo shirt, a shoulder bag, and the shadow of a regime that had long erased him. But someone was watching. Two people, in fact. Young women. One from Indonesia, Siti Aisyah, the other from Vietnam, Dokan Thi-hyung. Security cameras followed their movements. First they watched Kim from a distance, then they followed him through the terminal. Their approach was casual, almost cheerful. One stepped in front, distracting him. The other came up from behind and in a flash rubbed something on his face, something oily, fast and deliberate. One wiped his eyes, the other darted away. To the untrained eye it looked like a prank, a strange one. Maybe a YouTube challenge. Kim stumbled. He blinked. He looked confused, then panicked. Within seconds, he was sweating, clutching his head, staggering toward a nearby security desk. He tried to explain. said he'd been attacked, said it burned, said he thought he'd been poisoned. He was right. The airport medics were called. They sat him in a chair trying to help, but it was already too late. The substance had entered his skin, through his eyes, through his pores. Within minutes, his muscles began to fail. He grew faint, lost control, then consciousness. By the time he reached the hospital, barely an hour after the incident, Kim Jong-nam was dead. A man had just been assassinated in broad daylight in an international airport. In peacetime, in a country far from home, with no gun, no bomb, no shouting. Just a wipe to the face and two women walking calmly away. The questions began immediately. Who were these women? Who sent them? Why kill Kim Jong-nam now? And what, exactly, had they used? The answer would pull the world into a strange, cold shadow, one that led straight back to Pyongyang. The death of Kim Jong-nam hit the headlines like a dropped suitcase in a quiet terminal. Loud, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Within hours, the story had jumped from local Malaysian news to every major paper in the world. A high-profile North Korean in exile, murdered in broad daylight in the middle of a crowded international airport? People wanted answers, fast. Malaysian police wasted no time. By that same afternoon, they had sealed off parts of the airport, collected CCTV footage, and sent samples to the lab. It didn't take long for the results to come back. Poison. But not just any poison. This was VX nerve agent, a name that doesn't sound scary until you realize it was designed for war. One of the deadliest substances ever made by humans, so lethal that even a few drops on bare skin can kill in under 20 minutes, and banned under international law for decades. This wasn't a random murder, it was a chemical weapon attack. Investigators now turned to the footage. The two women who attacked Kim had been caught on multiple cameras, approaching him, swiping their hands across his face, then quickly separating and walking off. But here's what really raised eyebrows. Both women made a beeline for the nearest restroom. They weren't running or hiding, they were washing their hands. Not a panicked rinse, a full scrub. Experts later confirmed it. If VX only touches your skin and you wash thoroughly for 15 full minutes, you might be okay. But if it hits soft tissue like your eyes, nose or mouth, it's a death sentence. That's what happened to Kim Jong-nam. He didn't stand a chance. As for the women, they left the airport casually. No masks, no gloves, no disguises. It was almost as if they didn't realize what they'd done, or didn't know who their victim really was. But the authorities weren't fooled. With the cause of death confirmed, and the suspects caught clearly on camera, Malaysian police began the hunt. Who were these women? Who gave them VX? And most importantly, did they know they had just carried out an assassination? Before going any further into the case, it helps to understand the family behind it all. The Kim dynasty isn't just a ruling family, it's a legend built by force, fear, and decades of carefully crafted myth. It began with Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea and the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. He fought the Japanese, survived war, and became a national hero. In North Korea, he wasn't just a leader, he was worshipped. Statues, songs, school books. Everything said he was chosen by history. After he died, his son Kim Jong-il took over and kept the family myth alive. Under Kim Jong-il, the country grew even more isolated. People starved while the regime built palaces. Dissent was crushed. Loyalty was everything. Kim Jong-il married a famous actress, and they had a son, Kim Jong-nam. As the eldest, Jong-nam was seen as the heir. But then came another marriage, a dancer this time. She gave birth to Kim Jong-un, 10 years younger, and she had ambition. While Jong-nam enjoyed more freedom, his stepmother worked hard behind the scenes. Whispers say she used her influence to push her own son forward. It didn't hurt that Jong-nam wasn't exactly a model heir. In 2001, he was caught in Japan with a fake passport, trying to visit Tokyo Disneyland. For a country that viewed the US as the enemy, this was a disaster. Some believe the tip-off came from inside the family, perhaps even his stepmother. After the Disney scandal, Kim Jong-il quietly sidelined his oldest son. Jong-nam left the country, moved to China, and kept his distance. He wanted no part in ruling. He lived quietly, far from the madness. When Kim Jong-il died in 2011, Kim Jong-un, just 25, took over. Many doubted him, too young, too soft, but they were wrong. He moved fast, changed the image, made speeches, launched missiles, and when needed, removed threats, including his own uncle who was dragged out of a meeting and executed. Kim Jong-un had learnt the family rule: power isn't shared, it's protected at all costs. While Kim Jong-un ruled over North Korea with an iron grip, his older brother, Kim Jong-nam, wandered through East and Southeast Asia living what looked, on the surface, like a quiet life. But even quiet lives can stir trouble when they belong to the wrong person. Jong-nam didn't stay silent. Every now and then, he'd show up in interviews, saying things the North Korean regime didn't like. He said North Korea should open up to the world. He said leadership shouldn't be a family business. And he openly questioned whether his younger brother had any right to rule at all. To outsiders, those were just opinions. But inside the world of Pyongyang politics, that was treason. And not just because of the words, because of who said them. Jong-nam wasn't a regular critic. He was the oldest son of Kim Jong-il. In a dynasty like North Korea, that meant something. That made him dangerous. The regime saw it. So did China. Kim Jong-nam had been living under China's watch. North Korea and China had a complicated friendship, tied by history but filled with suspicion. If things ever went badly between Kim Jong-un and Beijing, Jong-nam could be useful. A backup plan, a puppet, a problem. But assassinating him on Chinese soil, that was a no-go. North Korea needed China too much, so the plan had to wait. Wait for a moment outside Chinese borders, somewhere easier, somewhere quieter. There were whispers of earlier attempts. South Korean intelligence believed North Korea had tried to kill him before. Once, Jong-nam even wrote a letter to his younger brother begging for mercy. He said he wanted nothing to do with politics, that he posed no threat, that he just wanted to live, but it didn't matter. In a family like the Kims, wanting to live wasn't always enough. So when Kim Jong-nam stepped into Kuala Lumpur International Airport, North Korean agents saw their chance. They struck. The plan worked. He was dead within the hour. North Korea denied everything. Of course they did. Less than a week after the hit at Kuala Lumpur Airport, Malaysia's police chief stepped in front of the cameras. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters leaned forward. The world was still stunned, and now everyone wanted answers. He gave them names. The two women caught on CCTV rubbing poison on Kim Jong-nam's face had been arrested. One was Duke Style, 28 years old, from Vietnam. The other was Siti Aisyah, 25, from Indonesia. Both were now in custody. The police said more details would come soon, but the investigation was still underway. And that's when things got even more interesting. Authorities revealed that there were 8 more suspects. All of them had links to North Korea. Some were embassy staff. Yes, actual employees of the North Korean embassy in Malaysia. At that time, Malaysia was one of the rare countries where North Korea had a working diplomatic mission. Out of those 8 men, 4 had been at the airport on the day of the killing. Security footage showed them there right before and after the incident, but they didn't hang around. They left Malaysia in a hurry, flying out just hours after the attack. The other 4 stayed in the country. Police believed they helped plan the operation from behind the scenes. Logistics, transport, communications, the whole setup. Some were hiding behind diplomatic immunity. That made things complicated. But for now, those details were secondary. The cameras, the headlines, and the trial ahead would all focus on the 2 women, the ones who actually touched Kim Jong-nam's face. What they did was clear, but the bigger question was why. Were they trained spies? Brainwashed? Just unlucky? That part of the story was about to unravel. News of the arrest spread fast, but no one was more shocked than the families of the 2 women. In Indonesia, Siti Aisyah's father was at a funeral when he heard his daughter had been arrested in Malaysia, accused of killing Kim Jong-un's brother. He rushed home, confused. He said Siti had always struggled working different jobs, trying to make a living, but never imagined something like this. In Vietnam, his Meksawa's family was just as stunned. They knew she had dreams of being an actress and was working in restaurants to support herself. Her father said she was a kind, normal girl. The idea that she could be part of a murder, let alone a political one, didn't make sense to him. As both families tried to understand what was happening, the world turned toward North Korea. Officials there denied involvement, but most weren't convinced. Kim Jong-nam had been a target for years. The attack felt too precise to be random. As mentioned earlier, Malaysian police had named 8 North Koreans tied to the airport assassination. 4 had already skipped town right after the hit. The other 4 stuck around, though not for long. One of them, Rai Jong-chol, was a chemist. He was believed to be the man behind the VX, because, let's be clear, this wasn't something you whip up with kitchen bleach and a YouTube tutorial. VX takes training, labs, and a steady hand. The second man was a North Korean embassy official. The third, an employee with North Korea's state airline. All three were rounded up and questioned. This did not go over well. The North Korean ambassador in Malaysia stood outside his embassy and held a press conference, angrily accusing Malaysia of fabricating charges and demanding his people be released. Malaysia, unimpressed, expelled him. North Korea fired back by trapping all Malaysian diplomats inside their own embassy in Pyongyang. No flights, no exits, a hostage situation disguised as diplomacy. For days, things got tense. But eventually, both sides made a deal. Malaysia agreed to release the 3 North Korean suspects. In return, North Korea let the Malaysian citizens come home. They also asked for Kim Jong-nam's body. Malaysia didn't argue. At that point, they just wanted the standoff to end. So the suspects were flown back to Pyongyang, free and untouched. Just like that, the only people left to blame were 2 women with no training, no motive, no idea what they'd really done. Both women were given separate law firms in Malaysia to defend them. From the start, the lawyers knew something was off. These weren't trained agents or career criminals. They were 2 young women with no ties to North Korea and no criminal history whatsoever. When the trial opened, one of the first people to take the stand was a chemical weapons specialist named Raja. He calmly explained to the court what VX really was. Not just any poison. This was the deadliest nerve agent ever made. Just a single drop. If it entered the bloodstream, could kill. Sometimes just touching the skin wouldn't do it. If you washed fast, you might live. But if it got into the eyes, nose, or mouth, that was it. Game over. Traces of VX were found on both women's clothing. That at least explained why Kim Jong-nam had died so quickly, but not them. They must have scrubbed their hands in time. The defense teams argued that this whole situation was wrong. The women weren't assassins. They didn't even know what they were part of. Meanwhile, the actual planners, the men who made the poison and gave the orders, had already left the country. The lawyers said their clients were being used as scapegoats, but prosecutors pushed back. They pointed to the security footage, the way both women had avoided touching their own faces, the way they rushed straight to the bathrooms right after the attack. Signs, they said, that the women knew something was dangerous about the liquid. They didn't even know what they were part of. Meanwhile, the actual planners, the men who made the poison and gave the orders, had already left the country. The lawyers said their clients were being used as scapegoats, but prosecutors pushed back. They pointed to the security footage, the way both women had avoided touching their own faces, the way they rushed straight to the bathrooms right after the attack. Signs, they said, that the women knew something was dangerous about the liquid. Still, the defense didn't back down. If they truly understood how deadly VX was, would they have smeared it with bare hands? Worn it on their sleeves? That didn't add up. So what really happened here? How did 2 strangers with no reason to kill anyone end up on trial for one of the boldest political assassinations in decades? This part of the story begins with Siti Aisyah, the young woman from Indonesia. After her arrest, she sat down with her lawyers and told them everything. She said the police had barged into her apartment without warning and taken her away. No explanation, no time to think, just handcuffs and confusion. During questioning, officers asked where she had been on February 13th, the day Kim Jong-nam was killed. Siti said she had been at the airport filming a video. When asked who she was with, she gave them a name, Mr. Chong. She tried calling him, his phone was off. Then the questions turned sharp. Are you a spy? Did you poison the man? Siti was stunned. She kept saying, I didn't kill anyone. I didn't even know who he was. But the police told her the truth. She had just been part of the murder of the North Korean leader's brother. She thought it was some kind of joke. She told them she was doing prank videos for a production company, that she'd done similar videos before. Smearing lotion or water on strangers while someone filmed and laughed. It was supposed to be harmless, silly content for social media, but her lawyer had to be the one to break it to her. Sivi, this isn't a prank. This isn't a show. That man is dead, and you were used. Sivi's story is painful. Back home in Indonesia, life had never been easy. She worked long shifts in a small clothing factory. The pay was bad. The hours were worse. Eventually, she married the owner. At 17, she had a child. But the marriage fell apart quickly. Her husband left and took their son with him. Hurt and alone, Siti left Indonesia and moved to Malaysia, hoping to start over. But even there, things didn't improve. She ended up working in a massage center, a job she hated. Broke and tired, she started looking for any way out. That's when she met a man named James. At least that's what he called himself. He said he was Japanese, said he worked for a video company, told her they made funny content, and they needed girls to be in their pranks. He promised quick money. no risks, nothing illegal, and with nothing to lose, City said yes. Just like City, Diguan Thihuguang said she thought she was doing prank videos. She told her lawyer she used to work as a waitress in a small restaurant in Vietnam. For 3 years she served food, wiped tables, and tried to make ends meet. But she had bigger dreams. She wanted to be famous, maybe an actress or a model. She posted photos online, tried out part-time modeling gigs, and kept hoping something would work out. Then one day, an old co-worker called her with an offer. He said a video company was looking for girls to be in prank videos. They made funny content, filmed quick jokes in public places. Duan was curious. She agreed to meet someone from the team. The man she met called himself Mr. Yoi. He was calm, friendly, and said he worked in media. He told her she'd get paid $1,000 a month to appear in their videos. For Duan, this sounded amazing. More money than she had ever made, and a chance to be on camera. She said yes. In fact, she had already filmed a few videos with them before the airport incident. In those clips, Duan could be seen playing pranks on strangers, splashing liquid on them, running away laughing. The footage still exists online, and it later became part of her defense. Her lawyers argued this wasn't a lie she made up after the fact. She had a real history of doing prank videos. She thought this was just another one. Like City, Duan had no ties to North Korea, no experience with politics. She was just another young woman trying to chase her dreams. Both were promised quick cash and a bit of fame. But they ended up at the center of one of the most shocking assassinations in modern history. Used, tricked, left behind. Both Siti and Dogon said they were recruited months earlier by different men working for different video companies. But these weren't companies, and it wasn't about comedy. In Siti's case, a man named James gave her baby oil, told her to sneak up on strangers and smear it on their eyes. It's funny in Japan, he said. Siti wasn't sure what was funny about it, but the pay was good, $100 a shoot, better than the job she hated before, so she kept doing it, filming what she thought were goofy pranks. There are real videos of Siti with James, some even on her own phone. He's visible on camera, but James barely spoke English. So another man stepped in, Mr. Chang. He spoke Indonesian and Japanese, plus maybe Korean. Siti believed he was a translator. He might have been something else entirely. They promised her travel, fame, more money. She was hopeful. She wanted out of her old life. And these men made her feel like this was her big break. Meanwhile, Dogon went through almost the same process. She was brought in by Mr. Y, who introduced her to Hanamori, his boss. She also practiced airport pranks. Videos from a Vietnamese airport show her sneaking up on strangers, covering their eyes, then laughing and walking away. It looked harmless, just awkward street comedy, but the coaching was specific. In messages between Dogon and Mr. Y, he told her she wasn't pressing hard enough on her target's face. He wanted her to hold longer, make it look real. She followed every instruction. In one video you can see her do exactly that. No hesitation. Back in Malaysia, Siti trained at Kuala Lumpur airport for 3 days before the attack, filming fake pranks in the exact same location. She even posted airport clips online. Duan did the same, sharing her travels, her meals, her outfits. This created a digital trail, something investigators later described as a digital footprint. Ironically, that trail helped prove what the women had claimed all along. They weren't trained killers, they were trained for something else entirely. February 13th, 2017, the day of the operation. Surveillance footage later revealed 2 key North Korean operatives, Hanamori easy to spot in a purple shirt, and another man using the name Oh Jong-gil. Both were believed to be intelligence officers and later vanished from Malaysia the same day. 2 others, Mr. Chun and Mr. Lahi, were each assigned to guide one of the women. Siti was seen at a cafe with Mr. Chun, who told her today's shoot was important. There would be new participants, he said. Siti looked relaxed, smiling and chatting, giving no hint she was minutes away from murder. Meanwhile, Mr. Yoi stayed close to Debon, repeating the same story. Big day, more people, important scene. She believed him. Around 9 a.m., Kim Jong-nam entered the airport to catch a flight back to China. The team was already in place. Hanamori, positioned by the entrance, spotted Kim and quietly alerted the others. Siti and Mr. Chang were waiting behind a pillar. Chang pointed to the man in the grey coat and handed her a vial of poison, disguised as baby oil. He applied it to her hands. Siti, still thinking it was harmless, nodded and prepared for what she thought was another prank. Just steps away, Mr. Yor coated Doden's hands with the same substance, instructing her to copy Siti exactly. As Kim passed by, Siti moved in, covering his eyes from behind. Confused, Kim turned around. Seconds later, Jong-un stepped forward and pressed her hands to his face. That was enough. The plan needed both women to ensure a lethal dose of the nerve agent. Kim sensed something was wrong almost immediately. Disoriented, frightened, he rushed toward airport staff. Meanwhile, Siti and Jong-un ran in opposite directions, heading for separate restrooms to wash their hands, still thinking they'd just pulled off another video prank. But when they returned, the men who brought them there were gone. At the same time, Hanamori, Oh Jong-gil, Mr. Yoi and Mr. Chang slipped into airport bathrooms to change clothes and ditch their appearance. Moments later, they regrouped with 2 North Koreans, an embassy official and a staffer from North Korea's airline. Those 2 were later arrested, then released under diplomatic pressure. With help from the embassy, the 4 core operatives calmly exited the terminal. They flew out of Malaysia that day, passing through Indonesia, Dubai, China, and finally home to Pyongyang. They escaped. The planners, the handlers, the brains of the operation. Only the women and 3 lesser suspects were left behind. And James, who first approached Siti, he never showed up at the airport. He vanished without a trace. In the end, the entire case in Malaysia came down to just 2 names, Siti and Jong-un. From the moment of their arrest, it was clear to their lawyers that neither woman had a reason to be involved in something this serious. No history with North Korea, no motive, no idea what they were really doing. It seemed absurd that all the blame would fall on 2 women who had been deceived from the start. But this wasn't just any trial. The stakes were life and death. If convicted of murder under Malaysian law, the punishment was execution. Their lawyers believed that would be a gross injustice. The prosecution saw it differently. They argued that the 2 women were the ones who physically delivered the poison, and no matter who planned it, that made them responsible. Their entire case leaned heavily on security footage, especially clips showing the women walking with their arms stiff, hands held away from their sides. That, the prosecution claimed, proved they knew the substance was dangerous. The defense responded that the women had only noticed their hands felt greasy and had a strange smell, something oily. So they washed up, just like anyone would. But that explanation didn't satisfy the court. Malaysia had just experienced an international assassination on its soil. Someone had to be held accountable. And North Korea had already made sure the real perpetrators were long gone. So the pressure fell entirely on Siti and Jong-un. Their legal teams worked non-stop for nearly 2 years. They collected every scrap of digital evidence, every photo, every message. They documented the women's lives before any of this, how they'd been recruited, how they were groomed, and how little they truly understood. Even so, the trial didn't start well. The judge made several remarks that didn't bode well for the defense. He seemed skeptical, even irritated by the suggestion that what happened could have been a prank. There was nothing funny about this, he said more than once. A prank is supposed to bring laughter. This brought death. His tone made it clear he wasn't buying the story. But then came March 10, 2019. In a surprise move, prosecutors dropped all charges against Siti. The judge, caught off guard, had no choice but to release her immediately. After 2 years behind bars, she walked out smiling, clutching her lawyer's hand. Jong-un wasn't so lucky. Unlike Indonesia, which had heavily lobbied for Siti's release, Vietnam made no strong diplomatic push. Maybe it was politics, maybe it was pressure from North Korea. Either way, her case remained. The charges stayed in place, and Jong-un stayed behind. Jong-un's next court hearing took place on April 3, 2019. Outside the courthouse, the mood was heavy. Reporters and photographers had already lined up before sunrise. The Vietnamese ambassador arrived with embassy officials, signaling just how much attention the case was drawing back home. Inside the courtroom, Malaysian law barred cameras, so the media waited by the steps, eyes fixed on the exit. Hours passed. Then finally, Jong-un appeared, smiling, relieved. She was still in custody, yes, but something had clearly changed. Later that day, her lawyer stepped out and gave the press the news. The murder charge had been dropped. Instead, Jong-un had pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, causing injury by dangerous means. It was a legal compromise. She received a sentence of 3 years. That wasn't an acquittal, but compared to what she had originally faced, execution, it felt like a miracle. Because Jong-un had already spent 2 years in detention, and because of good behavior, her remaining time was short. Just a month after the verdict, she was released. When she returned to Vietnam, the airport was packed. Dozens of journalists, photographers, and TV crews were waiting to film her arrival. In a way, Dodon finally got what she had wanted all along, the spotlight. But not for acting, not for fame. She was famous now for something far darker than she had ever imagined. She went home to her family. Siti did the same. She returned to Indonesia and moved back in with her parents. And just like that, this story, one of the strangest, boldest, and most tragic assassinations of the century, ended not in war or trial or execution, but with two girls walking home. Kim Jong-nam's death was fast, calculated, and over in seconds. But not every tragedy happens in an instant. Some unfold slowly, hour by hour, with no way out, like what happened to John Edward Jones, deep inside a cave in Utah. The death of John Edward Jones inside Utah's Nutty Putty Cave remains one of the most haunting caving tragedies ever recorded. Maybe it's the sheer terror of what he went through, or maybe it's the fact that John was just 26, with a young daughter and another child on the way. Whatever it is, something about those final 24 hours has stayed with people all over the world. If it's a story you're not familiar with, John was 26, a med student, home for Thanksgiving. On November 24, 2009, he entered Nutty Putty Cave with his brother, crawling on his stomach through a narrow tunnel. He thought he'd found the birth canal, a cramped section famous for its tight squeeze and how it spits you out like you're being born, but John had gone too far, past the big slide, into one of the cave's worst spots, a vertical drop that ends in a narrow, sloping dead end. By the time he realized he was stuck, it was already too late. He couldn't climb back up. A rescue team came. They tried everything, but after 27 hours upside down, John's heart gave out. Humans just aren't built for that position. Blood floods the brain, the heart strains harder. Eventually it gives out, even in the strongest body. After John was declared dead, officials made a decision. His body would stay where it was. Less than 10 days later, they sealed the entrance with concrete. Nutty Putty Cave was closed forever. What most versions of the story leave out is that John's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the final warning. Nutty Putty had always drawn thrill seekers, Boy Scouts, college kids, weekend explorers, but it was a cave that should have only been tackled by trained cavers. Between 2000 and 2005, there were 7 rescues. In 2004, a 16-year-old was pulled from the same crack John later got stuck in. 2 weeks later, another man was trapped for 8 hours. Even in 2001, 2 Boy Scouts went so deep they got caught beyond the birth canal. Rescuers freed them in 4 hours. That section, they renamed it the Scout Eater. Most stories ended well, but rescuers knew luck wasn't a plan. John's death wasn't the beginning, it was the final chapter in a long list of close calls. "10 years before John Jones died in Nutty Putty, it almost happened to someone else. 2 17-year-olds, Chris Marr and Chris Hales, had just one summer left before high school ended. So they made a plan to camp with friends and explore one of Utah's most infamous caves. They drove south from Salt Lake City, pitched their tents and settled in for the night. By 9 a.m. the next morning they were inside the cave. A little exploring, a little adrenaline, then Marr and Hales broke off from the group. They were after the birth canal. 12 feet underground, they crawled through the rock, Marr in front. Tight, claustrophobic, the kind of space where you breathe in just to move forward. But Marr had made a mistake. He thought they'd found the right tunnel. He hadn't. What he'd entered wasn't the birth canal, it was a dead-end fissure. And by the time he realized it, he was already in too deep. Face down, arms wedged, knees drawn to his chest, stuck. He shouted to Hales, who was already descending the same path, told him to turn back. But it was too late. Now both of them were trapped, upside down in a tunnel not meant for people. Nowhere to go, no way out, not without help. Thankfully their screams reached their friends. The others found them, turned back, and rushed out of the cave to call for help. Within the hour, nearly 40 rescuers were on site and gearing up for a long night. While rescue efforts were still forming outside, Marr and Hales stayed wedged in the rock, upside down, waiting. Their friends brought them food and water, passing supplies down the tunnel while they waited for the pros to arrive. Once rescuers entered the cave, the first step was to figure out exactly what they were dealing with. They asked both teens about how they were positioned, how they felt, how much space they had. Every inch mattered. Hours passed. From above, nothing much happened. But in the dark, narrow shaft, the two friends kept each other calm. They joked, they prayed, they cracked sarcastic comments about their own bad luck. Whenever one started to panic, the other talked him down. It wasn't until late afternoon that Ma's mother got the call. Her son was trapped. She immediately got in the car and drove straight to the cave. The entire way there, she kept thinking about the last time she saw him, smiling, calm, promising her it would all be safe. Inside the cave, rescuers finally had a plan. The best option, they believed, was to tie ropes around the boys' ankles and pull them up one at a time. So one rescuer slid down to Hales, wrapped the rope around his feet, and backed out of the fissure. With the path clear, they started pulling. Hales wriggled, twisted, contorted his body around the sharp, cold rock that had been jabbing his back all day. At 10:30 p.m., 12 hours after getting stuck, he was out. It would take a few more hours to get Ma out, but eventually, he too emerged into the open air. The boys hugged, they laughed. Both were scratched up, bruised and sore, but alive and lucky. Ma later said that, while trapped, he kept telling himself he wasn't claustrophobic, just to keep his head straight. And if you're wondering whether that experience changed him, it didn't seem to. Ma actually returned to Nutty Putty Cave 2 more times before it was sealed in 2009. On one of those visits, he crawled right back into the same tight spot where he'd once gotten stuck. This time, he made it out without a problem. But of course, not every caving story ends that way. Some do, most don't. May 14, 2022 was a beautiful spring day in Chiefland, Florida, with clear skies and a nice cool breeze that made its balmy temperatures much more tolerable. The area is home to Manatee Springs State Park, and as its name suggests, some of the park's waters are often inhabited by manatees, which brings in many tourists. One of its biggest attractions, however, is the underwater cave system, which was believed to be one of the longest in the world at one time, with more than 20,000 known caves within the system, which also connects to a handful of sinkholes from the surface. Manatee Springs State Park is a mecca of sorts for cave divers, and this is exactly what drew 2 father-son teams there late in the morning on May 14th. In most of the reporting on what happened next, the divers' real names were never released, so to keep things clear, we'll stick with pseudonyms. The 4 men, 2 fathers and their teenage sons were all technically cave certified, but only just. They'd completed the basic Intro to Caves course, and each had racked up around 100 dives, enough to feel confident, maybe too confident. The plan they followed wasn't even their own. It came from a YouTube video showing a dive through Manatee Springs. In the video, the narrator admits the dive goes against official cave diving guidelines, but says it's worth it. A thrill every cave diver should try at least once. For this group, that was all the permission they needed. They didn't study any maps, didn't ask experienced divers about the layout, didn't learn how the tunnels connected or what to expect. They just watched that video and remembered what they could. Their dive plan, a traverse, starting in one sinkhole and ending in another. They'd enter at Friedman Sink, a narrow 4-foot-wide drop straight into the tunnels. From there, they'd swim downstream past Sioux Sink, which is supposed to be an emergency exit only, and finally surface at Catfish Hotel, the largest, most popular sinkhole in the park. That meant covering about 1,412 feet, roughly 522 meters, underground. Each diver carried 2 side-mounted tanks at 3,800 psi. Side mounting makes it easier to slip through tight spaces. They also packed primary and backup lights. The 2 fathers mounted floodlit cameras to their gear, just in case. At about 11:15 that morning, the 4 divers entered Friedman Sink. They split into 2 pairs, as they usually did. The sons, Billy and Mike, took the lead. Their fathers, John and Dave, followed a few minutes behind. Inside the tunnels, they stayed close to the permanent guideline, a rope fastened from the entrance that cave divers use to keep their bearings when the water turns murky or the path twists into dead ends. These lines are essential in systems like this, where the tunnels are long and full of confusing branches. At first, everything was just as the YouTube video had promised. Tight turns, surreal beauty, the kind of scenery few people ever get to witness. Once they reached Sioux Sink, They followed a second guideline that should have taken them all the way to Catfish Hotel, their planned exit. But as they approached the end of the line, Billy and Mike stopped. Up ahead, the water turned thick with silt, a dark cloud that swallowed their lights. They couldn't see anything. Not the tunnel walls, not the guideline, just black. John and Dave caught up and were just as disoriented. Billy swam forward a little, hoping visibility would improve just ahead. But after a few feet, he stopped. It wasn't worth the risk. One wrong move and he could vanish into the cloud. He turned around and grabbed his underwater slate. On it he wrote a single word, manatee, followed by a question mark. He was starting to wonder if they'd passed their exit by mistake, if they were now heading toward Manatee Spring instead, a section of the system that was strictly off limits. What none of them realized was that the upline to Catfish Hotel, their planned exit, was just 10 or 15 feet away, practically within reach. But in that dense, swirling silt, 15 feet might as well have been 15 miles. So they made a decision based on the information they had. If the only options were to enter forbidden territory or turn back, the safer bet seemed to be retracing their steps and surfacing at the last sinkhole. The problem? That wasn't the plan they'd prepared for. Traverse dives, like the one they started, are one way. You enter in one spot, exit in another. But now they were doing what's called an out-and-back dive, backtracking through the entire system. And out-and-back dives require different gas planning, especially when a current is involved. There's a rule in cave diving called turn pressure, a minimum air pressure needed to guarantee you can make it back out. John did the math. Even under perfect conditions, they'd be cutting it close. But as soon as they turned around, it was clear these were not perfect conditions. The current was against them now. They had to fight for every inch, and that fight meant faster breathing and faster air consumption. John's breathing rate shot up almost instantly. He reached for the guideline, pulling himself hand over hand to keep moving. Each kick, each pull, each breath. It was all costing them air. But then, relief. He spotted Sue Sink's upline just ahead. Billy was already climbing toward the surface. John looked back. Mike and Dave were still moving, still okay. He flashed an okay signal. They returned one. Then, wasting no time, John grabbed hold of the rope and began his ascent. Ascent. Right at noon, Billy surfaced. 5 minutes later, so did John. Both checked their gauges. Billy's tanks still held just under half their air. John's were close, one slightly lower. They knew they'd dodged something serious, but neither allowed themselves to relax, not yet. Not while Mike and Dave were still missing beneath the surface. Minutes passed, no sign of the others. John grabbed his phone and dialed emergency services. Deep in the tunnel, Mike and Dave had accidentally passed the upline for Sue Sink. Disoriented by the silt and low visibility, they unknowingly pushed on toward Friedman Sink, their original entry point. As Mike reached the steep uphill climb, he turned back. Dave's light was still behind him, not far, so Mike kept going. When he reached Friedman Sink's upline, he didn't hesitate. He climbed. He surfaced at exactly 12:20. Then he looked at his gauges. One tank was completely empty, the other nearly so. And Dave, now the last one still inside, the one who had been in the cave longest, the one who still hadn't surfaced anywhere. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Just before 1 p.m. emergency divers arrived. By then it was obvious something had gone wrong. They dropped into the water, headed downstream from Friedman Sink. Before long they found a clue, Dave's camera, still on, floodlight faintly glowing. Not long after, 2 more divers from the International Underwater Cave Rescue and Recovery Team joined the search. They fanned out into the system, and then they found him. Dave's body was floating midway through the uphill stretch toward Friedman Sink. His tanks were completely drained. A later investigation by the National Speleological Society made one thing very clear. The fatal mistake happened before anyone even entered the water. The moment all 4 men decided to attempt that particular dive, Dave's fate was sealed. The Manatee Springs system is a siphon cave, meaning its strong current always flows in one direction. Combine that with a traverse-style dive, where you enter in one place and exit in another, and you've got a challenge even for veteran cave divers. The NSS emphasized that none of the 4 understood the strength of that current, or how their chosen entry point would work against them. By starting at Friedman Sink and swimming downstream, they were gambling everything on not needing to turn around. If they did, the current would be their enemy. And that's exactly what happened. But that wasn't the only issue. Manatee Springs State Park has two key rules for cave divers. First, you must be fully certified in cave diving. Second, if it's your first time in the system, you have to dive with someone who knows it well. These four men broke both. Their only preparation came from a YouTube video. None of them had ever dove there before, and none of them knew the cave beyond what they remembered from watching a screen. In assigning responsibility, the NSS first pointed to John. When he reached the Sioux Sink up line and signaled to the others, he should have waited, should have made sure they saw him before continuing. Then came Mike. He surfaced at Freedman Sink before confirming that Dave had reached the line behind him. Lastly, the NSS didn't hold back when it came to the creators of the video that inspired the dive. In the cave diving world, safety is everything, and encouraging underqualified divers to try Manatee Springs, just for the thrill, was described as reckless. And almost as if to underline the system's dangers, another tragedy struck a year later. In 2023, a diver with full certification and years of experience, accompanied by others who knew the cave well, was caught by the current. It forced him into the ceiling, tore off his mask and rebreather, and ended his life. Poland's deepest and largest known cave is called Śnieżna Cave. Its full name in Polish translates to Great Snowy Cave, and it's located on the northern slopes of the Tatra Mountains, a natural wall dividing Poland and Slovakia. The cave system is so vast that it has 5 separate entrances, each at a different elevation, spread across the mountain's rugged terrain. It was first discovered back in 1959. Since then, Polish caving clubs have spent decades slowly exploring and mapping it. Each new expedition peeled back another layer, finding more passages, discovering unexpected tunnels that link to other cave systems, even uncovering exits in distant towns no one expected to be connected. So far, they've charted nearly 15 miles of passageways, about 24 kilometers, and measured a depth of 824 meters, or 2,703 feet. Most of that came fast. In the 1960s, cavers had already reached nearly 2,500 feet. But then things slowed dramatically. For over 60 years, explorers have only managed to push about 250 feet deeper. Because the cave doesn't just go down, it fights back. It gets colder, tighter, and far more dangerous the deeper you go. But that hasn't stopped anyone. The effort to uncover its full depth continues. On August 15, 2019, a small group from the Wrocław Caving Club made their way into Śnieżna Cave. Out of all the clubs exploring the system, this one had spent the most time inside. They knew its twists and drops better than almost anyone. The goal this time was to reach an area called Śmielowata, a section nearly 2,000 feet below the highest known entrance. To get there, they'd need to camp along the way. Around 8 p.m., 6 cavers entered the Great Snowy Cave. They covered some ground and then set up camp inside. With caves this vast, you don't reach your destination in a day. You move in stages. So the next morning, the team pushed deeper, eventually setting up a second camp, this one closer to the goal. From there, they planned to split up. By 6 p.m. the next day, 2 of the group, Daniel and Joseph, headed toward Śmielowata. The others explored a different route. The plan was deliberate. That area of the cave is tight and narrow. Too many people would just slow things down. But sometime before 9:30 that night, Daniel and Joseph hit trouble. There had been days of off-and-on rain in the Tatras, and now water was spilling into the cave. They were already heading back when they realized it. The tunnel they'd passed through earlier was gone, completely underwater. When they didn't arrive back at camp, the others went looking for them. What they found was shocking. Every path the 2 men could have taken was submerged. The group began yelling through the cave, hoping to reach them. And somehow Daniel and Joseph shouted back. They were alive, but trapped. They couldn't get through. The tunnels were too tight, too submerged. Holding your breath wouldn't help. Even a few feet would take too long to squeeze through. And it was getting worse. Every 30 minutes they checked the water, and every 30 minutes it was higher. By 2 a.m. on August 17th, the remaining cavers made it back to the second camp. There was nothing else they could do except get out as fast as they could to find help. The problem was, climbing out takes twice as long as going in, so by the time they reached the surface and got cell service, it was already 5 p.m., over 12 hours since they'd last seen Daniel and Joseph. Their call went to the Tatra Mountain Search and Rescue Team, TOPR, and the operation started right away. But it wasn't going to be easy. The closest way in would require a helicopter. And down where the men were trapped, the tunnels were tight, too tight to send in more than a few rescuers at a time. Still, within 2 hours of the alert, the first Top ER members were at the site. One of the original 4 cavers who had gone to get help joined them, guiding the team into the cave. The rescue began at 8 p.m. exactly 48 hours after the expedition had started. Finally, at 3:00 a.m. 24 hours after the 2 men became trapped, the team reached the flooded tunnel. From there they assessed the options. One was the original route, now underwater. The other was through a section that was always flooded. But the team ruled that path out immediately. It was too dangerous. That left only one way, the dry tunnel. The same one Daniel and Joseph had used, but it was extremely narrow, barely passable. So the plan was to widen it using explosives. But that would take time the men might not have. Because when the rescuers tried to call out to them from the other side of the flood, they heard nothing. They couldn't tell what the conditions were like on the other side. If the men were still alive, they were likely soaked, freezing, and deep in the dark. Carbon monoxide down there could also be much higher than normal. By the evening, officials feared the men were in advanced hypothermia, and even after all that effort, rescuers were still no closer to reaching them. Every time the rescue team set off a new charge to widen the tunnel, they had to retreat. The dust and smoke would linger for hours, and the blasts released carbon monoxide, dangerous, invisible, and slow to clear. For 2 or 3 hours after each explosion, the cave was off limits. It simply wasn't safe to go back in. Meanwhile, there was still no word from Daniel and Joseph. No shouts, no taps, nothing. As the hours dragged on, the outlook got worse. By the afternoon of August 19th, the Top R chief gave a grim update to the media gathered outside the cave. At that point, he said, the chances of survival were extremely low. The effort wasn't stopping, but it had slowed to a crawl. Without a proper way to clear the air between blasts, even clearing a few feet of rock was taking hours. On August 20, the team began constructing a ventilation system to improve air circulation, but the effect was minimal. Even though the passage had been blasted open to around 16 feet wide, up from just a few feet, it was still full of rubble. Every chunk of debris had to be hauled away by hand, one by one, which took time they didn't have. Progress was so slow that officials briefly reconsidered the previously dismissed route, the tunnel that was always underwater. Maybe divers could go in that way instead. But a second, more thorough assessment shut that idea down. It was still far too dangerous. Finally, near 4th afternoon, a breakthrough. Rescuers had blasted most of the entrance open when they spotted equipment. Daniel and Josef's gear scattered just ahead. There were 2 harnesses, some food, and a damaged drill. Signs they had made it at least this far. Then, that night, came the most haunting moment of the entire effort. A rescuer pressed his ear to the rock and froze. Through the stone he could hear snoring. Not just a faint echo or imagined sound. Actual snoring. One of the men was still alive. But it wasn't the kind of snore you hear in sleep. This one gurgled and rasped. It was the sound of a body in late-stage hypothermia. If there was any chance to save them, it had to happen now. But just after midnight, as August 21 began, another delay. Not from the cave, but from outside. Locals, unauthorized and uninvited, had entered the system, trying to sneak a closer look at the rescue. The team had to stop what they were doing to chase them out. Worse, they'd gotten in through another entrance. So now more rescuers had to be pulled off the main effort, just to guard the rest of the cave. By noon, 12 more hours in, the rescuers could tell they were close. But after the gurgling sounds the night before, hopes were dimming. Then disaster. One final blast brought the tunnel down. Around the 300-meter mark, 985 feet, the roof gave out and collapsed into the fissure. Nobody was in the path when it happened, but it wiped out everything. The ropes, the ventilation system, and most importantly, the opening to the chamber where the men were believed to be. The only option left was to start clearing the passage again, stone by stone, this time knowing exactly how little time was left. By 10 found that night, word finally reached the surface. A rescuer had made visual contact with one of the men. He wasn't moving. He wasn't responding. They couldn't reach him yet, and they couldn't confirm which of the 2 it was, but they knew. He was gone. The following morning, Top ER held a press briefing and made it official. The rescue effort was now a recovery operation. At that point, they were working under the assumption that both men had died. The body they had seen was lodged in a narrow pipe-like section of the passage. It looked like the two men had tried to get themselves out. Maybe they'd pushed forward in desperation. Maybe they got stuck. Either way, rescuers suspected the water had risen behind them, pooled by their own bodies, and overwhelmed them where they lay. The Wrocław Caving Club wasn't ready to accept that. They challenged the assumption that both were dead and sent a request to the Prime Minister of Poland, urging him to compel TOPR to keep searching. But the decision held. The operation would continue as a recovery only. Then, on August 24th, another discovery. A piece of cloth deep in the tunnel, likely from the second man. Still, it would take until September 5 before that second body was finally recovered and brought to the surface. Autopsies would confirm what many feared but hoped against. Neither man had drowned. Both had succumbed to hypothermia. On September 17th, 1 full month since Daniel and Joseph had been reported trapped, the final piece of equipment used in the recovery effort was hauled out of Śnieżna Cave. The mission was over. The explorers in Śnieżna Cave faced a danger they could see and touch: ice, rock, and the crushing weight of the mountain above them. But sometimes the most terrifying threats aren't physical at all. Sometimes they come from a shadow you can't see and a voice you can't trace. For Cindy James, that shadow found her in 1982. It started with a phone call. Just one, short, threatening, and untraceable. But for the woman who picked up the phone, that moment marked the beginning of a nightmare. One that would grow into one of the strangest and most unsettling mysteries in all of Canadian history. Cindy James had been doing well in the fall of 1982, and for her that meant a lot. Life up until then had been mostly ordinary. She was born into a military family, moved around a bit growing up, finished high school, and later became a nurse. Just a regular life from the outside. But underneath that normal surface, there had always been shadows, parts of her story that didn't fit quite right. Moments that would seem, in time, much darker than anyone realized. Cindy was born on June 12, 1944, in Oliver, British Columbia. She was one of 6 kids. Her father, Otto, served in the Canadian Air Force, and like a lot of military men, he ran a tight ship. Cindy wrote in her diary about how strict he was. Corporal punishment was a regular thing in their house, used whenever Otto thought it was necessary. While the family was living in Ottawa, Otto got reassigned, this time to France. But Cindy wouldn't be going with them. Instead, she moved back to British Columbia to begin nursing school. During breaks, she flew out to visit them in France, though most of the time she kept in touch with letters. At first, her letters were mostly about school and day-to-day life, but over time she started mentioning a male intern she'd met. Then, out of nowhere, she wrote that the two of them were engaged. Soon after, another letter came, this one saying the man had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. While on a ski trip together, he had taken his own life. Oddly, Cindy never mentioned his name. No one in her family ever met him. That part stayed a mystery. It led some of her relatives to wonder if the story was even real, or if it was something Cindy had made up, either in her head or on purpose. Three years later, Cindy met a South African doctor named Roy Makepeace. He was 18 years older than her, but the age gap didn't stop them from falling into a relationship. Eventually, they got married. This time, there was no mystery. Roy was real, and Cindy talked about him openly. But even still, Otto wasn't thrilled. He worried that his daughter was too trusting, and that Roy might be taking advantage of that. There was no proof that Roy had bad intentions, but it also wasn't the kind of love story you'd hope for. Before long, Cindy's letters back to France started sounding different. She wrote that she and Roy were growing apart, that the marriage felt cold and distant. Later, she even said Roy had gotten physical with her more than once. During this time, Cindy left her job at Vancouver General Hospital, where she'd worked as a pediatric nurse. She took a new role as team coordinator at Blenheim House, a care centre for children with behavioural problems. But while her work life was changing, things at home weren't. The marriage kept breaking down piece by piece. By the summer of 1982, it had become too much to bear. Cindy and Roy agreed to separate, and it wasn't a bitter ending, just two people going their separate ways. Afterwards, something in Cindy seemed to lift. She embraced the freedom, and more than anything, she threw herself into her new job. For the next 4 months, everything seemed to fall into place. She was happy, settled, and finally starting to feel like her life was hers again. That piece came to an end on October 7th, 1982, when the phone rang. Cindy answered, and the voice on the other end spoke in a low, whispering tone, then hung up. At first she brushed it off, probably a wrong number, maybe just static on the line, but it wasn't. That call marked the start of something much darker. From that point on, Cindy began receiving harassing, threatening, and obscene calls. It would go on for the next 7 years. She told the Royal Canadian Mounted Police about it, and an officer came by to check things out. At that point it was only a few strange calls, so he advised her to keep a detailed log of each one and suggested switching to an unlisted number. Cindy agreed. The officer left, but seconds after he walked out the door, the phone rang again. Silence on the line, and then, the very next day, the voice was back. This time, it mentioned the officer who had visited. The phone calls were just the start. Within days, things took a darker turn. About a week after that first eerie call, Cindy caught a glimpse of someone lurking around her house. The next morning, her porch lights were smashed. Soon after, a rock came flying through one of her windows. Someone had broken in. But strangely, nothing was missing, nothing out of place, except for one thing. On October 19th, another break-in, and this time one of the pillows on her bed had been sliced open. Every time something happened, Cindy did what the police told her to do. She called them. And now that the harassment had clearly escalated, investigators began to take it more seriously. In interviews, they asked her about her past, her job, her personal life. Most importantly, her ex, Roy Makepeace, became their top suspect. A recent separation, a history of violence. It made sense, but Cindy didn't see it that way. She admitted he had been physical with her. The police already knew that. Roy admitted it too. But this, stalking, threats, break-ins, it didn't fit. The cops didn't rule him out, but they started to widen their search. Could it be a co-worker, a neighbor, someone who knew she was living alone now? Nothing was off the table, but no one stood out. Meanwhile, the phone calls kept coming. So did the strange noises, and Cindy wasn't the only one hearing them. On October 20th, her basement tenants told her they'd heard sounds from upstairs. Banging, movement, but the house had been empty. Cindy was at work. She called the police again. This time a constable named Patrick came out. He interviewed the tenants, then knocked on doors nearby. One neighbor told him they'd seen a man outside Cindy's home, more than once. It could have been the break they needed. But when asked if the man looked like Roy, the neighbor shook their head. No, it wasn't him. In the middle of everything, the calls, the break-ins, the tension, Patrick showing up almost felt like fate. He was just there to take a statement. But something clicked. Whatever it was, it didn't take long. The interview turned into conversation, then into something more. Patrick, like Cindy, was recently separated, and within days of meeting her, he moved in. Now Cindy wasn't alone. She had someone by her side, someone who believed her, someone who could help if things got worse. Just days after Patrick moved in, he was taking out the trash when he noticed a car parked in the alley behind Cindy's house. A man sat inside watching. Patrick walked up. It was Roy. Cindy's estranged husband said he was trying to catch the stalker. Patrick told him he lived there now. Roy didn't say much, just drove off. Weeks passed. The calls kept coming. One night Patrick answered one. Silence. Then a click. Police tried tracing the calls, but they never lasted long. But the phone calls, creepy as they were, weren't the worst part. Not even close. One morning in late November, Cindy stepped outside to head to work. Her car looked normal, until she got closer. There, tucked under one of the windshield wipers, was a photograph. She circled around, pulled it free, and just stared. It showed a body, covered by a medical sheet, lifeless, cold. She felt her chest tighten. Later that day, Patrick walked the property and found something else, something darker. The phone lines had been slashed, not once, 5 times. Whoever this was, they were playing a longer game. Oddly enough, despite everything, Cindy and Roy were still on good terms. And even more surprising, Patrick and Roy had begun to get along. Dinners with the three of them weren't rare. They'd sit down, talk about the case, and try to make sense of it all. Roy even seemed genuinely interested in helping. Weeks passed. Patrick eventually moved back to his own place on December 1st. But he and Cindy stayed close. As Christmas approached, she let herself hope for peace. Just a quiet holiday. But it didn't last. One morning, another note, another photo. This one was worse. The message said, "Merry Christmas." The picture? A woman dead, with a gaping wound along her neck. The calls, the notes, the sightings, they never really stopped. But, for a little while at least, they didn't get any worse. That peace wouldn't last past January. On the night of the 27th, Cindy's friends Tom and Agnes showed up at her house without warning. Her car was in the driveway, but no one came to the door. They knocked again, still nothing. Agnes figured she might be in the bath. Cindy always loved her quiet evening soaks. They were about to leave when Agnes paused. She heard something, a sound, maybe a scuffle, coming from behind the house. They followed it. And there, near the detached garage, was Cindy, hunched over, eyes wide, a black nylon stocking tied hard around her throat. They rushed in. Tom pulled at the stocking. Cindy wheezed, coughed, finally breathing again, and then shakily she told them what happened. She'd gone out to the garage to grab some boxes, but someone had grabbed her first, from behind, dragged her into the garage, where another man waited. Together, the two had taken turns choking her with the stocking, and one of them had a knife. She said he attacked her. Tom ran to call the police. When they arrived, Cindy was taken by ambulance to the hospital. Thankfully, she was conscious and stable, but strangely, doctors couldn't find any marks or wounds from a knife. And so, just like that, a new theory emerged. Maybe Cindy wasn't a victim this time. Maybe she was the one behind it. Investigators were getting nowhere. The phone calls, the break-ins, the notes, and now this? The attack didn't fully make sense. But what if the explanation was Cindy herself? Problem is, too many other people had seen things. Neighbors had spotted strange figures around her home. Tenants heard noises above them when Cindy wasn't even there. Patrick himself had picked up one of those eerie calls. So maybe not. Still, police had to explore everything. They urged Cindy to speak to a psychiatrist. She said no, said she didn't want anyone, especially the police, to think she was crazy. And so the investigation stalled again. The calls didn't stop, the letters didn't stop, and moving twice didn't help either. It was like someone had eyes on her at all times. By mid-1983, Cindy felt abandoned by the very people meant to protect her. So she hired someone else, a private investigator named Ozzy, someone outside the system. Ozzy dove in headfirst. He spoke with police, read every report, but the more he learned, the more unsettled he became. Something about Cindy's story didn't add up. She wasn't lying, not exactly, but she wasn't saying everything either. Now that he was working for her, Ozzy decided to keep watching. Not just the outside threats, but Cindy herself. More than a year since the nightmare began, things reached a new low. In late 1983, someone left 3 dead cats in Cindy's garden, tied up with rope. Ozzy, now her investigator, gave her a 2-way radio in case she ever needed help fast. One night, it crackled with strange sounds. He rushed to her house. No answer. Peering through the porch window, he froze. Cindy was on the floor, motionless. He kicked in the door. She was alive, barely, but a paring knife was stabbed through her hand, pinning a note to the floor. Magazine letters spelled out, "Now you must die." Cindy survived. She later said she'd seen a man come through the gate. Then darkness, maybe a needle. Doctors did find a puncture, but toxicology showed no drugs. Police pushed for a polygraph. At first she passed, but on review the results were called inconclusive. Then on June 18, 1984, another call. Ozzy arrived to find Cindy hysterical in the garden. She said someone had broken in. She'd fled. Ozzy searched the basement. There was Heidi, Cindy's dog, tied up. Nearby was a note, "Happy birthday," and a stack of graphic photos. On the windowsill sat a cigarette butt. Wrong brand. Not Cindy's. For Ozzy, that changed everything. He was now sure Cindy hadn't staged any of this. Over a year had passed since Cindy's torment began, but whoever was behind it clearly wasn't finished. One night in early 1985, around 8:30 p.m., Cindy was out walking her dog Heidi through a quiet park near her home. It was something she did often, one of the few routines that still gave her a sense of peace. But that night, peace was nowhere to be found. She didn't come home. Not long after, a neighbor looked out their front window and saw Cindy on the porch, except it wasn't hers. She was panicked, disoriented, desperately trying to open the door of a house that wasn't her own. Her hands fumbled with the handle. She looked terrified and confused, like she had no idea where she was. Paramedics were called. Cindy was taken to the hospital, dazed, barely able to explain what happened. Doctors found 2 fresh needle marks on her arm. She had clearly been drugged. Again. Then came the phone call. The hospital receptionist picked up the line. A man was asking questions, not about a patient but about security. How many guards were on duty? Were visitors allowed at all hours? He had a foreign accent, calm but rehearsed, creepy in its precision. Later, investigators played a recording of Roy's voice for the receptionist. Did it sound like him? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, it did. Not long after, things spiraled further. That summer, Cindy attempted to take her own life and was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. For police, this was confirmation of their growing suspicion that maybe this was all self-inflicted, that maybe the threats, the stalking, the attacks had another explanation entirely. But then December came, cold and dark. Around 6 p.m, drivers passing along a road in Vancouver spotted something in a ditch. At first they thought it might be trash, a tarp maybe. Then someone looked closer and saw a person. It was Cindy. She was unconscious, badly beaten, with bruises, scratches, and a deep mark around her neck. A black nylon stocking, again, and once more, needle puncture wounds on her arm. Paramedics got her stable. She lived. But when doctors asked her what happened, Cindy had nothing to give them. She couldn't remember how she got there. By early 1986, the fear in Cindy's home had become something you could feel in the walls, the creaks in the floor, the weight in the air. There had been too many close calls, too many phone calls, too many nights spent frozen by the sound of a footstep, a shadow, a whisper through the phone line. So Tom and Agnes, her longtime friends, decided to stay with her, just to keep watch, just in case. One night, well past midnight, a sound broke through the stillness of the house. A bang. Something loud and sudden from downstairs. Cindy jolted awake, but she wasn't the only one. Tom was already sitting up. He'd heard it too. He wasn't the kind of man who spooked easily, but something about this noise didn't feel right. He got up, grabbed a flashlight, and headed down with Cindy behind him. When they opened the basement door, heat hit them first, then the glow. The basement was on fire. Agnes, now fully awake, raced to the phone, but the line was dead, cut, again. Tom bolted out the front door, hoping to find help. That's when he saw him. A man, just standing there in the dark, across the street, barely lit by the flames coming from inside the house. Tom called out. The man turned and ran. When the fire was put out and the scene calmed, it seemed obvious what had happened. Cindy had been attacked again, and this time someone had tried to burn her out, but the police didn't see it that way. Despite everything, despite Cindy's friends witnessing it firsthand, officers were suspicious. There were no signs of forced entry. None of the windows had been disturbed. And that meant, in their eyes, Cindy might have staged it all. It didn't add up. But neither did the rest of this story. In the days after the fire, Cindy stayed with Tom and Agnes. She barely ate, barely spoke. Sometimes she would sit quietly and say things like, "I don't think I can do this anymore." Her mind and body were exhausted. She was unraveling, and everyone around her knew it. Her psychiatrist, who had been watching the slow descent for months, finally stepped in. Cindy was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. 10 weeks of intensive care. A full evaluation. Doctors were looking for something, anything, to explain what was happening to her. But when she left the hospital, little had changed. The reports kept coming. She'd call the police. Another letter. Another shadow. Another voice on the phone line. It didn't stop. Through 1987. Through most of 1988. Then came October. On the 11th, Roy found 2 strange messages left on his answering machine. One of them wasn't just strange. It was a threat. A direct one. On Cindy's life. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Cindy was found in the garage, unconscious, strangled with a black nylon stocking, just like before. But this time it was worse. Her wrists and ankles had been bound tightly, hog-tied. Another voice on the phone line. It didn't stop. Through 1987, through most of 1988, then came October. On the 11th, Roy found 2 strange messages left on his answering machine. One of them wasn't just strange, it was a threat, a direct one, on Cindy's life. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Cindy was found in the garage, unconscious, strangled with a black nylon stocking, just like before. But this time it was worse. Her wrists and ankles had been bound tightly, hog-tied. Police brought in a knot expert to examine how she was tied. They needed to know, was it possible she did this to herself? The expert studied the ropes, the tightness, the angles, the placement. Then he looked at the photos of Cindy as she was found. His conclusion? Highly unlikely. There was almost no way she could have done it alone. On the morning of June 8, 1989, a city truck rolled to a stop beside an old, forgotten property in the Richmond neighborhood of Vancouver. The house was boarded up. The grass was long dead. It had the silence of a place no one was supposed to see. A municipal worker stepped out, shoulders relaxed, thinking it was just another job, until he looked up. Across the side of a rusting fuel tank, someone had spray-painted a message in thick, angry strokes of fluorescent orange. Graffiti wasn't anything unusual in his line of work. But this message? It stopped him cold. From a distance, he could already make out the shape of the words. As he got closer, it was worse than he thought. Crude, taunting, obscene. The kind of thing you might scrawl only if you hated someone deeply, or wanted the world to see what you'd done. The paint didn't stop at the tank. There was a long, winding line, also in orange, that trailed across the dirt and grass. The worker followed it, uneasy now. The line continued to the backyard, ending in a large circle. And in the center of that circle was Cindy. Her body lay curled on its side, hog-tied, a black nylon stocking wrapped tight around her neck. She had been dead for some time. The smell confirmed that. The heat hadn't helped. Nature had already begun to claim her back. Forensics arrived quickly. The scene was sealed, but the facts only made things more horrific. Her hands had been bound so tightly that one of her fingernails had sliced through the skin of the neighboring finger down to the bone. A small puncture mark was found on her arm, another needle. Her body showed no signs of external trauma beyond what the bindings had caused, but the autopsy painted a grim picture. She had been poisoned. A mixture of powerful sedatives had been found in her blood. The dose of morphine alone was staggering, 10 times greater than what any doctor would legally administer. 2 additional drugs were found in her stomach, also in lethal quantities. The coroner was blunt. With just the morphine, she likely would have died within minutes. To most, it looked like murder. There was a body, a crime scene, a toxicology report, and years of threats to point to. The harassing phone calls, the photos, the break-ins, the stockings. It felt like the end of a long and twisted game, one final act from someone who had been tormenting her for nearly a decade. But not everyone agreed. The RCMP had doubts. Deep ones. They looked at Cindy's psychological record, 7 years of reports, 100-plus police filings, stays in psychiatric hospitals, erratic behavior, memory lapses, suicide attempts, and they started asking different questions. Had she staged this too? Or had she meant to scare someone and accidentally gone too far? They weren't sure. So in the spring of 1990, nearly a year after Cindy was found, a coroner's inquest was launched to settle the matter. A jury of 5 was tasked with answering the question no one had been able to. What really happened to Cindy James? Over 80 witnesses took the stand. Her sister, her ex-husband, police officers, psychologists, friends, forensic experts, even the doctors who had tried in different ways to understand her mind. And that's when another layer of complexity was revealed. Each doctor had a different diagnosis. One said Cindy suffered from histrionic personality disorder, a condition marked by excessive emotional reactions, dependency on attention, and an overwhelming need to be seen, traits that could, in theory, explain some of her behavior. But in a case like this, where every thread seemed to unravel into another, one diagnosis was never going to be enough. Another psychiatrist came forward. His conclusion: borderline personality disorder, a condition that could cause someone to spiral between extremes, abandonment fears, paranoia, sudden shifts in emotion. It wasn't a comfortable explanation, but it was one the jury had to consider. And then came a third opinion. This one suggested something even more fractured: dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. The theory was that Cindy may have been split, in some psychological sense, into different selves. One self trying to survive, another trying to stage, another trying to end it all. In this light, some of the confusion began to make a kind of terrible sense. But none of those doctors were the most impactful voice in the courtroom. That belonged to someone else entirely. A not expert, not the one police had consulted earlier, but another specialist brought in for the inquest. He had spent decades studying bindings, self-ties, contortion techniques, practical knowledge from the world of climbing, rescue, even stage magic. And when he took the stand, he didn't speak in theory, he demonstrated. Right there in front of the jury, he showed how a person, yes, even someone under the influence of drugs, could bind themselves in a way that looked impossible. He sat, quietly focused, and began to loop the rope. Under, over, twist, pull. He tied his hands and legs behind him, mimicking the exact position Cindy had been found in. The room watched in silence. 3 minutes later, he was done, bound, hogtied, alone, no help, no tricks. And suddenly the door of possibility swung wide open again. But the problem was that one explanation never fit everything. That demonstration didn't erase the phone calls, or the photos, or the notes, or the countless witnesses: Tom, Agnes, Roy, even her neighbors, who had all seen and heard things over the years that were impossible to explain away. Were they all mistaken? All duped? Or was Cindy really stalked for years by someone who was patient, cruel, and meticulous? Someone who fed off fear and confusion? That was the true weight of the case. Not just how Cindy died, but how she lived in those final 7 years. When the inquest concluded, the jury was left in limbo, just like the rest of the world had been. They debated, they reviewed, but in the end, they could not say if Cindy James had been murdered, if she had taken her own life, or if it had all been a tragic accident born from mental illness and fear. And so officially, the cause of death was ruled as unknown. Cindy James, who had cried for help, who had begged for someone to believe her, who had been hospitalized, stalked, tied, drugged, and left to die, was now a mystery even in death. So now it's up to you. Was Cindy a deeply troubled woman who orchestrated every piece of her torment? A slow unraveling over years, fueled by trauma and illness? Or was there someone else behind the curtain? Someone who stayed just far enough away, just quiet enough to make her seem unbelievable? Because in the end, the only thing certain is that no one was ever brought to justice. And no one ever truly knew the whole truth.